We had a marvellous moment at a Good Start kind of gathering of the band a few weeks ago that June and Myra and others were at. And very propitiously, it was on a day that we would have fantasised about a decade ago, because it was a joint announcement from this state's Premier and the Premier of New South Wales, you know, kind of Dan the man from left of centre, Dominic Perronnette, kind of hard-bitten, right-wing fiscal martinet. They were saying the same thing about the significance of early learning. And going back to the front end of Good Start, the idea was, how do you actually encourage an understanding so that this becomes mainstream? Because the reality of social change and the currency of social change is a game of patience, it's a game of bipartisan convincing, and it's particularly about, for audiences like this, you know, this is an audience, in Paul Keating's language, of the true believers. You have to convert, you have to proselytise. And so the provocation is this: don't take for granted this transformational moment. And you know, the challenging story that I'll share with you with Good Start CEO Julia Davison, we had an incredibly informing trip and met with a remarkable woman who you and June know well, Sarah Watson, who led Ready Nation. What was Ready Nation? It was a really powerful American-based alliance of military leaders, business leaders, unlikely allies around pursuing the cause for significant policy and funding change in early learning. Sarah and that organisation, well funded, supported by one of the leading US foundations, Pew. What do you think happened to them in 2016 after that election, when Trump was elected? The short answer is actually not much point in them existing while Trump was in power at a federal level. I'm making a harsh point, but the point is this: God forbid we get a Trump in this country. But don't ever take for granted the idea that when you make progress, you get governments convinced to do the right thing, that we can rest on our laurels. The other voice of wisdom and perspective I'll bring into the room on that point, my great friend Richard Spencer, who is a CEO of Benevolent Society, one of the founding partners of Good Start. He became a member of the Productivity Commission, a man who deep insight, very thoughtful guy. So look, if you look at the data, and there's some evidence-based work on this, from the point where something is unequivocally known, think the significance of early learning, name major social policy change, on average, from the point where that's reasonably well known and mainstream in an evidence scientific community, it takes 17 years for that to be converted into mainstream and policy knowledge. So I reckon, I know there are people in this room who've been working on it for longer than that, but do not take for granted that window, and work your damnedest. It's not actually so much forums like this. Is you've got to keep finding the Robin Crawfords of the world. You've got to find those who are sitting on the fence, or better still, those who are sceptical. And that was the light on the hill in meeting you and others behind that. You know, the light on the hill globally, and we learnt to look globally for what is good practice around that. At Good Start was when, you know, the work of a bunch of people, Naomi Eisenstadt, Ted Mellowish and others, meant that what was a Blair Brown initiative in the late 90s, early 2000s, what was the big moment in that? That in 2007, when a Conservative Prime Minister, David Cameron, was elected, said, we've got to cut the hell out of the social purpose world, but we will not touch early learning. Why? Because that battle, to a significant extent, has been fought and won. So let me come back to your specific question. It's something we talk about a lot at the Ramsay Foundation. We, as a foundation, and we're not the only ones, you know, the landscape, I think, in Australia is changing for the better philanthropically. We want to be thoughtful, we want to be strategic, we want to be backing organisations that are making a real and tangible difference in community. And the gift of the partnership with June and our place is that here's evidence, and you visit that community, and this is personal. You mentioned, you know, I'm involved in this work because I grew up in one of those communities, and I've travelled with Julius and June to Morwell, and it's quite emotional going back. You know, the site of the Good Start Early Learning Centre is literally the Commercial Road primary school I went to when I was a kid, from 1965 to 1970. That's a bloody tough community, and it hasn't got easier. So the ability to make a difference in a community like that, and to bring the great practical experience of Doveton and replicate that, is the challenge that sits before us all. The challenge for us is finding those sorts of partnerships and making sure that there is funding available for that, often hard to find funding to maintain the momentum and to fund organisations that advocate, and so that we don't have the gates closed and the windows shut when we think we've made progress.
Michael, that's absolutely great, and I love hearing it when you do the end bit, because what we all need to remember, this work is intellectual, it is rational, but it's personal, and it's okay for it to be personal. I think we don't often talk about that enough, and I deeply respect the work that you've done across all these sort of fields, Michael. Just can I pick up one point though, this notion of, we used to talk a lot about scaling, but increasingly we're talking about sustaining. I think that's a really powerful point you're making around the longevity. Have you got any sort of hints or prompts on, yes, you need to convert the right people, and have you got the right mix of people around you, but what else are signals or pursuits if you want to deeply sustain it?
Yeah, let me tease out some points that Christy was raising, because I mean, in my reincarnation as a reformed investment banker, I worked at Macquarie Bank for 15 years and left that to set up Social Ventures Australia's founding chief executive. So believe me, I feel the pain of being a non-profit social entrepreneur CEO. You've had that journey yourself, Christy, and I think the perspective on that is communicate relentlessly and show evidence, get people in the field. There are really good people, and get them to understand the complicated things. There are funders for that. Julius backed June because he saw what a difference Doveton could make, and I know Julius well enough, he won't mind me saying this. He doesn't mind banging on doors at Parliament House and saying, you need to see this, you need to support that, and became a facilitator advocate for it. People get, that was Robin Crawford, and I think people get the preparedness to use their access and networks, to use their philanthropy, and actually to fund things that are, I think of it as three-dimensional philanthropy. So we had a lot of funders at Social Ventures. Christy's had a similar experience in her previous work at Social Impact, the Centre for Social Impact. June's had the lived experience of this. Take funders on a journey. They'll invariably want to, I don't want to be dismissive of many good business people, but a lot of business people start with, I want to do some good, but I'm not funding admin, and I want to fund the kids to make a difference for the kids, but I don't want any money wasted. Well, guess what? If you can make a compelling case that funding admin, strategy, funding for scale, funding for advocacy can actually be the highest, greatest impact that you can have, but you must be in front of people and converting them and letting them see what sort of difference their money can make. And I think the market is actually, thank God, becoming a lot more structured and sophisticated on that.
So telling our stories, yeah. Okay, that's great. Thank you very much, Michael. Thank you for the panel. I'm sure you'll join me in thanking them for that.